They hit me with a $30,000 fine for a cabin that wasn't even on HOA land. When I proved it, things took a very unexpected turn. Picture this: me standing in my cedar cabin, handmade from the ground up, coffee steaming in the crisp mountain air, gripping a pile of legal papers that was about to shake my entire neighborhood. The scent of sawdust from my last bit of trim still lingered, mixing with pine needles crunching beneath my boots. That ridiculous fine notice sat on my kitchen counter demanding $30,000 for a structure supposedly unauthorized, even though it stood a full 847 feet outside HOA borders. What they didn't realize was how much I knew about property lines, corrupt boards, and how badly things can go when you pick a fight with a retired electrician who's got nothing left to lose. So let me ask you, what would you do if your HOA tried to fine you for building on your own land? And where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I'll bet you've got HOA horror stories of your own. My name's Garrett Steele. 2 years ago, I thought retirement was finally within reach. At 52, with 3 decades as a union electrician behind me and a modest savings set aside, I pictured myself spending my golden years tinkering in the workshop, with my wife Melody smiling at me from the kitchen window. But cancer had its own plans. When Melody passed, our home in Pinridge Estates felt like an echo chamber, me rattling around inside like a marble in an empty can. Beige walls approved by the whole Preston around me, and every flawless lawn reminded me of projects she and I would never finish. That's when I remembered Uncle Ray's 40 acres in the Colorado foothills, a piece of wild land he'd left me years back that I hadn't visited much since his funeral. It sat just past the last HOA street sign where the perfect lawn stopped and the real forest began. That first morning, breathing sharp mountain air mixed with the earthy smell of fallen leaves, hearing my old diesel generator rumble to life, I knew exactly what I needed: a cabin. Nothing extravagant, just a place where a man could drink his coffee without someone measuring his grass height. Now, at 30 years in electrical work teaches you anything, it's this: always pull the permits. I'd seen too many weekend builders get burned cutting corners. So I marched down to the county office and filed for everything: structural, electrical, septic. Cost me an extra $300, but those little yellow slips meant my 600-square-foot cabin was as legal as Sunday church bells. And that's when Vivian Hartwell showed up. Vivian was the type who introduced herself by title: HOA President Vivian Hartwell, like she was announcing royalty. Always in expensive pantsuits, back straight like she'd never left a corporate boardroom, and a sharp smile that looked like it came straight from an HR seminar on handling difficult employees. At 58, she ruled our 5-person HOA board like it was her empire. In her world, every mailbox had to be the approved forest green, every fence exactly 6 feet tall, and every flower bed filled with plants from her precious list. She even carried a tape measure in her purse. I'd seen her whip it out to check neighbors' lawn decorations. Dedication, or madness, depending on how you see it. Vivian had mastered what I call corporate condescension, that special tone that made "have a blessed day" sound like a threat. She always gave me that tight smile, slipping little reminders about community standards into our conversations, while her eyes said something else entirely, about blue-collar retirees who didn't fit in. The morning it all shifted, I was fighting with a stubborn window frame when I heard the crunch of expensive tires on gravel. Sure enough, Vivian's spotless white Lexus glided up to my property line. Out she came, balancing in high heels that immediately started sinking into the forest floor. Steele, she called sweetly, stepping carefully like she was walking through a minefield. I do hope you've gotten the proper approvals for this little project. I pointed to the bright yellow permit nailed to a pine tree. County says it's all good, ma'am. Her smile twitched for the briefest moment, but I noticed. Well, county permits are one thing, she replied. HOA approval is quite another. That should have been my first warning. But at the time, I was more concerned with getting that window square. And honestly, I figured anyone reasonable would understand. The HOA's authority ended at the street signs. 2 weeks later, a certified letter landed in my mailbox. It demanded $30,000 for a cabin built on land that had existed outside their grasp for 15 years before the HOA was even created. I sat on my unfinished porch, bitter coffee cooling in my hands, staring at the final line. Ignorance of our covenants is no excuse for blatant violations. That's when I realized something about bullies. They rely on exhaustion, banking on you being too worn down to push back. They had miscalculated. The next morning, I did what any rational person would do. I picked up the phone and called Vivian directly. Why let this balloon into a legal mess if a straightforward conversation could solve it? After all, we were neighbors, and neighbors should be able to settle things like reasonable adults. Mrs. Hartwell, this is Garrett Steele. I got your letter about the cabin, but there must be some mistake. My property sits outside HOA boundaries. The silence on the line stretched long enough for me to hear the gurgle of my coffee maker, followed by what sounded suspiciously like papers being shuffled. When she finally replied, her voice carried that polished, saccharine corporate tone that could rot teeth. Mr. Steele, thank you for reaching out, but our jurisdiction covers all member properties, regardless of their location. The covenants are perfectly clear. With respect, Mum. I have county permits that show why. I'm sure you do, she interrupted smoothly. However, our legal counsel has reviewed the matter thoroughly. The fine stands. Good day. I sat staring at my phone, listening to the flat dial tone, wondering if I had somehow stumbled into a parallel universe where property lines were optional and HOA presidents ruled like monarchs. The smell of scorched coffee pulled me back to reality. Turns out righteous anger doesn't stop kitchen appliances from burning your breakfast. Within a week, Vivian had escalated into what I can only describe as psychological warfare. First came the formal complaint to county code enforcement, accusing me of running an unlicensed rental property. The irony was rich. She twisted my legally obtained permits into something criminal. Then came the gossip campaign. At the grocery store, I'd overhear murmurs, neighbors avoiding eye contact, suddenly fascinated with their shoelaces when I walked past. In the cereal aisle, I caught someone whisper, "Poor man hasn't been right since his wife died." Grief clouds judgment. You know, small town whispers like living in a glass bowl full of piranhas. Her crowning tactic was organizing homeowners into her own private spy network. Every time I drove my truck toward the mountain road, some neighbor would appear from behind a hedge, phone in hand, feigning concern. When I had lumber delivered, people emerged from the tree line snapping photos like I was an endangered species being tracked in the wild. The breaking point came when Vivian herself marched up to my porch, clipboard in hand, with that predatory smile plastered across her face. "Garrett," she said sweetly, as if we were old friends enjoying tea, "I've been considering our little situation. Perhaps we can find an arrangement. I'm listening. If you were to stop construction immediately and dismantle the structure, we might be willing to reduce the fine to something more manageable. Say, $5,000 for the administrative burden." I looked at her standing there, offering to graciously discount a completely fabricated fine by more than 80%, and something inside me shifted. There's a moment when you realize someone thinks you're gullible enough to fall for their scam. That metallic tang of adrenaline when your blood pressure spikes and your ears buzz. "Mrs. Hartwell," I said evenly, "I think it's time I did some research of my own." Her smile flickered. Just for a second, like a faulty light bulb. "Research, property deeds, survey maps. Maybe even the original HOA documents you keep referencing." That following Tuesday, I walked into the Jefferson County Courthouse, armed with coffee and a stubborn determination. 30 years of working alongside inspectors had taught me one thing: bureaucracy may be slow, but paperwork doesn't lie. Every boundary, every easement, every covenant leaves a trail in ink and signatures. The first revelation came quickly. Buried in the incorporation records of Pine Ridge Estates was proof that HOA boundaries weren't just informal agreements between neighbors, they were strictly defined. Those boundaries are mapped and defined the same way city limits are. When an HOA incorporates, it must file precise boundary lines with the county clerk. The next thing that surprised me was finding out Uncle Ray's 40 acres had been deeded and recorded 15 years before Pine Ridge Estates was even developed. That meant the property was grandfathered, existing rights that later agreements can't override. No matter how official the letterhead looks, the real knockout punch, though, was tucked inside the HOA's own covenants, Section 1 to C. Subsection 4 plainly stated in formal legal phrasing that the association's authority applied only to properties within the platted boundaries recorded with Jefferson County on March 15, 2008. There I was, sitting in the courthouse basement among the musty stacks of old records and the steady fluorescent buzz, reading that line 3 times to convince myself I wasn't dreaming. My cabin wasn't merely outside their reach, it was legally impossible for them to claim authority over it. Time to hire a surveyor. The county clerk recommended Rex Morrison, a man who didn't suffer fools, and who treated property law like it was carved into his grandfather's fence posts. At 62, Rex had the worn look of someone who'd spent for decades arguing property lines and usually winning. "Let me guess," he said after I explained everything, tipping his battered cap. "HOA thinks they own everything you can see from their street sign." I nodded. He smiled as he unpacked his transit, the morning mist curling around the scope like the ghosts of old disputes. "I've seen this movie before," he said. "Those suburban kingdoms treat lines like suggestions. GPS doesn't lie. And neither does proper surveying." 3 hours later we had the verdict, 847 feet. My cabin sat exactly 847 feet beyond Pine Ridge Estate's legal boundary. I mailed certified copies of the survey to every board member with a courteous letter asking them to withdraw the fine and issue a formal apology. Vivian answered within 48 hours, "Surveyor error. The fine stands. Pay immediately or face a property lien." That's when I realized this had stopped being about boundary markers. It was about control, about a woman who'd rather crush a neighbor than admit she was wrong. A lien on my home was a different kind of threat. The fine itself was just painful numbers on paper. But a lien threatened the house and equity Melody and I had built for 30 years. Vivian had moved from nuisance to a real danger. She wasn't finished. Within a week a sleek black sedan rolled up my driveway and a man in an expensive suit stepped out carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. Vivian followed, wearing her practiced concerned neighbor expression and clutching a manila folder as thick as a ledger. "Mr. Steele," the man said, offering a manicured hand, "I'm Richard Blackwell of Blackwell Morrison and Associates. We represent Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." I'd seen their billboards on Highway 6, a firm that handled community governance disputes, which translated to steamrolling homeowners who stepped out of line. Blackwell opened his briefcase with a showman's flourish. "Mrs. Hartwell has shared her concerns about your construction project," he announced. Then handed me a cease and desist that was a textbook in legal intimidation, 23 pages of whereas clauses and formal language that boiled down to one demand: stop building immediately, or we'll make things unbearable for you. Here's where Vivian made her first real misstep. She got greedy. While Blackwell droned on about community harmony and protecting property values, Vivian decided to conduct her own inspection of my yard. From the kitchen window, I watched her in action, measuring the gap between my fence and the sidewalk with her ever-present tape measure, snapping pictures of my mailbox angle, and no exaggeration counting the decorative rocks in my flower bed. That's when it dawned on me. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore. She was building a portfolio of supposed violations, stacking the deck with anything she could twist into a fine. It was like watching her go on some bizarre HOA safari, hunting infractions as if they were trophies. The following morning, another certified letter showed up. According to her, my mailbox sat to 0.3 inches too close to the sidewalk. Fine, $500. The stain on my fence was apparently too weathered to meet community standards. Fine, $750. And the truck I had parked in my driveway for 8 straight years, suddenly, it was being classified as a prohibited commercial vehicle. Fine, $1,200. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by violation notices and legal papers, feeling like I was sinking into bureaucratic quicksand. Even the smell of fresh coffee couldn't wash away the bitterness in my mouth. That's when I remembered something my old union steward used to tell us: when management brings in lawyers, it's time to learn their rulebook. So, back to the courthouse I went, this time with a different purpose. If Vivian wanted to play the legal game, I needed to understand the playbook. After 3 days of digging through public filings, I stumbled onto something fascinating about HOA operations. By law, they're required to submit annual reports to the Colorado Secretary of State, complete with financial breakdowns. And those numbers told the story. Pinridge Estates HOA collected around $180,000 a year in dues and fees, but nearly $45,000, about a quarter of their budget, went straight to legal expenses. For a neighborhood of only 120 homes, where the biggest disagreements were over Christmas lights and lawn ornaments. That was way out of proportion. Then came the real gem. Tucked inside the vendor payments, Blackwell Morrison and Associates had been paid $67,000 over the last 18 months for covenant enforcement. That averaged out to roughly $3,700 a month in legal fees for a subdivision where most people just argued about lawn care. Either this was the most lawsuit-heavy HOA in Colorado history, or someone was getting awfully comfortable burning through other people's money to enforce their authority. So, I decided to test the theory. That evening, I went door to door with one simple question: have you ever gotten legal threats from our HOA? The answers floored me. Martha Henderson was fined $800 for planting roses instead of the approved marigolds. Bob Schmidt was hit with a $1,500 penalty for putting up a satellite dish deemed visually disruptive. Jennifer Walsh received a cease and desist for running a home-based accounting business, apparently a violation of the No Commercial Activity Clause. In every case, the HOA had brought in Blackwell's firm. And in every case, homeowners had paid up rather than endure a costly fight. The pattern was undeniable. Vivian had effectively turned enforcement into a cash machine, with Blackwell as her hired enforcer. But here's what she hadn't planned on. I was retired, furious, and had nothing but time to dig deeper. The very next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies, requesting a full audit of Pinridge Estates' finances. I also mailed a certified letter to every single homeowner, laying out the HOA's legal expenses and asking a few pointed questions about where their dues were really going. Vivian's reaction came fast: a certified letter accusing me of defamation and threatening legal action for spreading false and malicious statements about HOA operations. But this time, something was different. Her threats didn't feel intimidating anymore. They felt desperate. She was rattled, and we both knew it. But people in power rarely back down when fear sets in. They dig in deeper. Her next move came as an emergency community meeting notice slipped under every door in Pinridge Estates. The subject line screamed, "Urgent safety concerns regarding road member actions." The meeting was set for Thursday night at the community center, and the agenda alone was enough to spike my blood pressure. Item 1, discuss harassment and defamation by a member. Item 2, propose a special assessment to fund the HOA's legal defense. Item 3, consider suspension of membership privileges for disruptive behavior. In plain English, Vivian wanted to brand me a dangerous agitator, stick the neighborhood with the bill for her legal crusade, and push me out of the HOA altogether. Ironically, being kicked out might have solved my problem if she weren't still trying to claim control over my cabin. Her talent for twisting any win into a vendetta-driven loss was impressive in its own twisted way. I spent 3 days prepping for that meeting like it was a court case. My ally, Rex Morrison, put his surveyor's expertise to work helping me build a visual presentation. We mounted aerial maps, boundary surveys, and those damning HOA financial records onto foam boards big enough for the back row to see. When Thursday came, the weather matched the mood: gray skies and a fine Colorado drizzle that left everything smelling of wet pine and storm on the horizon. Inside the community center, the atmosphere buzzed. Neighbors shuffled in, many carrying copies of my letter about the HOA's legal spending. I could see the split immediately: Vivian's loyalists up front, glaring, and a growing cluster of skeptical homeowners in the back, quietly murmuring about their dues. Vivian strode in wearing her sharp navy blazer and that frozen smile that could stop coffee mid-pour. She opened with her usual authority, "Thank you for attending tonight's emergency session. We're here to address serious concerns about one member who has disrupted community harmony with harassment and false claims." Then she gestured toward me as though I were something unpleasant. scraped off the road. Murdoch Steele has been spreading misinformation about HOA finances and enforcement. Tonight, we must decide how to protect the community from this destructive behavior. That's when I stood, foam boards in hand, and asked the question that flipped the entire meeting. Mrs. Hartwell, before we discuss my supposed harassment, could you please explain to everyone here exactly where the HOA's legal authority begins and ends? Her confidence faltered for the first time. Our authority extends to all member properties as clearly outlined in the covenants. I walked to the front and folded the aerial photo and pointed to the highlighted red boundary line. According to Jefferson County records, your jurisdiction ends here at Granite Ridge Road. My cabin is right here. I tapped the map, showing it sat over 800 feet outside that line. The crowd murmured, restless. Martha Henderson, who'd once been fined for planting roses instead of marigolds, raised her hand. If Mr. Steele's cabin is outside the whole boundaries, why are we fining him at all? Vivian's voice shifted into condescension, the kind used on children. Martha, property boundaries are more nuanced than simple survey maps. Our covenants clearly state. No, they're not, a voice cut in from the back. Rex had arrived, still in work clothes, holding a rolled survey map. He strode forward, and rolling the official county survey across the table. Boundaries are legally defined, recorded, and clear, and this cabin sits on grandfathered land, predating your HOA by 15 years. The room erupted. Neighbors crowded forward, pointing at the map, whispering, questioning. Vivian stood frozen, eyes wide, caught in the headlights. Then Bob Schmidt, the man fined for his satellite dish, asked the bombshell question, Mrs. Hartwell. If we've spent $67,000 chasing claims that aren't even legitimate, what other enforcement actions might be just as questionable? That cracked the dam. One by one, homeowners stood up with their own stories. Jennifer Walsh explained her home business restriction that didn't exist in the original covenants. Tom Bradley pointed out fence height rules that contradicted county codes. Maria Santos revealed a mailbox color mandate that was never in official documents. Every single case had generated expensive letters from Blackwell's firm. Every single homeowner had paid rather than fight. The pattern was undeniable now. Vivian had been inventing violations to bleed the community for revenue. This is absurd. Vivian finally snapped, her polished exterior splintering like cracked porcelain. None of you appreciate how hard it is to uphold community standards when homeowners second-guess every single decision. These legal fees are essential to preserving your property values. The room went completely still. In that instant, everyone realized they weren't just looking at a neighbor, they were staring at someone who saw them as subjects in her private fiefdom. Rex Morrison's voice sliced through the tension like a knife. Ma'am, safeguarding property values doesn't give you the right to trample on property rights, and it certainly doesn't justify spending Ryan else's money on sham lawsuits. That was my cue. Speaking of spending everyone else's money, I unfolded my last display board. Let's talk about the $23,000 collected for playground improvements that somehow never materialized. Vivian's face drained of color. The spark of rebellion had been lit. Suddenly the atmosphere in the room felt like the air before a thunderstorm, charged, electric, inevitable. That fund is being held in reserve pending contractor negotiations, she stammered, her voice losing its usual edge. The words came out wooden, rehearsed, like she'd practiced the excuse in front of a mirror. 3 years, Bob Schmidt called from the back. My kids have been waiting for that playground since kindergarten. They're in middle school now. And then, an unlikely ally shuffled forward. Josephine Carter, 78 years old, barely 5 feet tall, carried a battered cardboard box that looked like it had survived a dozen attic cleanouts. Mrs. Hartwell, Josephine said, her voice steady, carrying the weight of someone who'd lived through the Great Depression and wasn't impressed by petty tyranny. I think it's time we talked about my late husband's files. Silence fell like a curtain. Even the AVIC system seemed to pause. Harold was the HOA treasurer for 12 years before his stroke, Josephine continued, setting the box down with a thud that echoed like a judge's gavel. He kept meticulous records, old accounting habits, bank statements, receipts, minutes, correspondence, everything cross-referenced and dated. Vivian's complexion had shifted from pale to A queasy green, like spoiled milk. Mrs. Carter, I don't think private financial records are appropriate. These aren't private, Josephine interrupted, her hands steady as she lifted the lid with the care of someone handling an explosive. Harold always said HOA finances should be transparent as glass. He sent copies to the state oversight board every year, just as required by law. She drew out a thick manila folder labeled Discrepancies 2019 to 2022 in Harold's neat handwriting. You see, before his stroke, Harold noticed irregularities, missing receipts, and explained expenses. Vendor payments for services never rendered. He planned to bring it all up at the 2022 annual meeting. She let the folder drop onto the table with a slap that made several people jump. But then Harold had his stroke, and you, Mrs. Hartwell, graciously volunteered to take over his duties. Very generous, very convenient. I watched Vivian's hands tremble as Josephine spread Harold's immaculate documents across the table, bank statements showing checks to phantom contractors, invoices for legal services billed at triple the market rate, payments to Pinneridge Property Management LLC, a company Harold had traced to Vivian's own home address. Harold spent his final months trying to reconcile these discrepancies, Josephine said quietly, but her words commanded the room. He calculated roughly $47. Zero in unexplained spending over 3 years, money meant for improvements, snow removal, actual maintenance. The figure hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. That's not true, Vivian croaked, her voice cracking on the last word. Harold was confused after his stroke. These records aren't reliable. Josephine's eyes went cold as ice. My husband's mind was sharp as a tack until the day he died. Young lady, are you implying that 40 years of professional accounting expertise simply vanished because of a minor stroke? Rex leaned over the papers, scanning them with the precision of a surveyor. Ma'am, these bank records show clear patterns. This isn't confusion, this is evidence of intentional financial manipulation. And then it clicked for me, the final tumbler sliding into place. Vivian's relentless pursuit of my cabin finds had nothing to do with property values or covenant enforcement. It had everything to do with generating cash flow to cover the money she'd already siphoned off. The trumped-up violations, the inflated legal fees. The so-called special assessments weren't about maintaining the neighborhood at all. They were designed to plug the holes left by the money Vivian had siphoned into her own pockets. She hadn't been running an HOA. She'd been orchestrating an elaborate embezzlement racket, hiding behind legal threats to silence anyone who dared ask questions. My refusal to hand over that fabricated $30,000 fine was the crack in her for weighed the risk that could unravel everything. Josephine closed Harold's folder with a decisive snap. The question now, she said, her voice steady as steel, is what we're going to do about it. That's when it hit me. This fight had grown far beyond my cabin. It was about justice for an entire neighborhood that had been bled dry by the very person entrusted to protect it. The battle was just beginning, but now I wasn't alone. I had an army. The meeting ended with Vivian storming out, hurling accusations about altar abuse and malicious prosecution over her shoulder. Half the room erupted in furious conversations about stolen money and betrayal, while the rest sat in stunned silence, struggling to process that their HOA president had been looting them for years. Josephine, bless her, stepped up once again. Anyone who wants to pursue justice, come to my house tomorrow evening. I'll make coffee, and we'll sort this mess out properly. Her no-nonsense tone sharpened by decades of running PTA fundraisers and church potlucks brooked no argument. The next night, 23 homeowners crowded into her living room, transforming it into a makeshift command center. Rex dubbed it Operation Accountability. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with a palpable determination. Neighbors who had finally had enough of being pushed around. Rex had even brought reinforcements. Benjamin Cross, a retired attorney with decades of HOA litigation under his belt and a personal vendetta against corrupt boards. At 65, Ben carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 40 years dismantling bullies in courtrooms. First things first, Ben said, spreading documents across Josephine's dining table like a general preparing a campaign. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Based on what I've reviewed tonight, Mrs. Hartwell has committed multiple felonies: embezzlement, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. He tapped Harold's meticulously labeled files. The beauty of financial crimes is they always leave a trail. Every bogus check, every forged invoice, every shady transfer is admissible in court. Henderson raised her hand tentatively, as though back in a classroom. What about the fake fines she's been hitting us with? Are those illegal too? Absolutely, Ben replied without hesitation. HOA letters can only enforce legitimate covenants written into your recorded agreements. Creating violations just to collect money is textbook fraud. That's when I learned something every civics class should teach. HOA letters aren't little monarchies. They're corporations, bound by state oversight and federal law, no different than any other business. They can't just invent rules and demand payment any more than a grocery store can suddenly decide you owe them rent for shopping there. Rex flipped open his laptop. We'll need a proper evidence inventory, he said, already typing. So far we've got Harold's financial records, the survey maps proving my cabin is outside their jurisdiction, and a documented pattern of fraudulent enforcement. But we'll need more. Jennifer Walsh, who'd been targeted for running her home business, volunteered immediately. I'll canvass every house in Pinneridge. We'll collect every violation notice from the last 3 years. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Bob Schmidt offered his camera to photograph supposed violations, proving most were fabricated or based on non-existent standards. Tom Bradley, a retired IRS auditor, stepped up to cross-check every HOA expenditure against actual improvements delivered. The plan that emerged was simple but devastating. File simultaneous complaints with 3 agencies: the Colorado Secretary of State for corporate fraud, the Jefferson County DA for criminal embezzlement, and the Department of Regulatory Agencies for HOA violations. Meanwhile, Ben would prepare a civil suit to recover stolen funds and damages. The key, Ben explained as Josephine topped off everyone's coffee, is coordination. We hit them on multiple fronts at once, so they can't concentrate their legal firepower on any single case. But our true strength was something Vivian had never considered: solidarity. Tom's accounting expertise made our numbers ironclad. Jennifer's organizational skills ensured every homeowner's story was logged. Rex's surveying work locked down property boundaries beyond dispute. And Josephine was our moral compass, the steady reminder that this wasn't just about money. It was about a principle: neighbors shouldn't steal from neighbors, and trust should never be an excuse for theft. The most satisfying moment came when Rex leaned back and said, "We should all install security cameras. If she's desperate enough to pocket $47,000, she's desperate enough to try intimidation or sabotage." As it turned out, we didn't have to wait long to see our suspicions confirmed. Just 3 days later, while I was finishing up the last touches on my cabin's front porch, breathing in the sharp scent of wood stain and listening to the steady rhythm of my hammer driving nails, I caught the sound of footsteps crunching over gravel. My new security camera captured the scene: someone in dark clothes trying to wreck my generator with a crowbar. The high-end hiking boots gave them away instantly. Vivian had escalated from intimidation tactics to outright sabotage. But unlike the neighbors she had bullied before, I was prepared. We all were. The footage was handed directly to the sheriff, with duplicates sent to our lawyer and the district attorney. Within a day, vandalism and trespassing charges were filed. Even more important than the criminal case was what came next: the rallying of the community. People who had stayed silent for years finally stood up, sharing stories of harassment and bogus fines that revealed the full scope of Vivian's abuse. The tables had turned. The predator had become the prey, and Vivian was finally realizing she was trapped. The criminal charges shattered her carefully crafted image like a hammer through glass. Word spread through Pine Ridge Estates within hours, faster than a brush fire in August. The woman who had preached endlessly about community standards had been caught on camera smashing property like a common thug. But instead of retreating, Vivian fought back with the ferocity of someone watching her world unravel. If I thought being charged would break her arrogance, I was wrong. I was about to learn just how ruthless a cornered narcissist could be. Her opening move was to hire a crisis management firm. Apparently, There are companies that specialize in protecting crooked HOA officials. Within 2 days, slickly designed flyers started appearing on windshields across the neighborhood. They painted me as a mentally unstable widower who harassed board members and endangered community safety, professionally printed, with graphics and bullet points. They read like political smear ads. Fake neighbor quotes accused me of obsessively targeting legitimate governance. And that was just the start. Vivian's masterstroke was online warfare. Fake Facebook accounts began seeding rumors in local groups, spinning stories about my supposed instability and threats. They weren't blatant enough to be obvious lies, but persistent enough to stir doubt. Rex Morrison spotted the first fake account when his daughter tagged him in a post warning about dangerous homeowners. The supposed poster, Sarah Johnson, turned out to be a stock photo model from Nebraska. She's trying to control the story before the truth comes out, Ben Cross remarked grimly during our meeting at Josephine's house. It's actually smart to discredit the messenger before the message is revealed. That was when we realized just how deep Vivian's corruption ran. Tom Bradley's forensic accounting uncovered something far bigger than we'd suspected. The shell company, Tinneridge Property Management LLC, the one funneling whole money, wasn't just her personal stash. Was tied into a larger web of shell corporations, kickback deals, and shady contracts involving local businesses, law firms, and even county officials. Look at this, Tom said, fretting bank records across Josephine's dining table like puzzle pieces falling into place. For 3 years, every major HOA contract, snow removal, lawn care, maintenance, had gone to companies that funneled money back to Tinneridge Property Management. Costs were inflated by 30 to 40%, padding revenue for kickbacks. The scope was jaw-dropping. What we thought was $47,000 missing ballooned into nearly $180,000 siphoned away through systematic fraud. Vivian hadn't just skimmed HOA accounts, she'd engineered a full-scale corruption machine, rigging every community expense to enrich herself. And that's when things took an even darker turn. Jennifer Walsh's door-to-door evidence hunt had uncovered a disturbing truth. Our neighborhood scandal wasn't isolated. 3 other HOA letters in Jefferson County were dealing with nearly identical problems: bloated legal fees, trumped-up violations, and suspiciously inflated project costs, all traced back to the same circle of contractors and law firms. This isn't just one crooked HOA president, Ben said once the scope became clear. We're looking at coordinated fraud across multiple communities. This has federal case written all over it. That's when Vivian made her boldest and most reckless move yet. On Friday evening, an emergency meeting notice appeared under every door. The agenda: a special assessment vote to cover urgent legal defense against so-called frivolous complaints and harassment lawsuits. The price tag, $2,500 per household, payable immediately, amounting to a $300,000 war chest. The vote was set for Monday night. Barely enough time to mount resistance, and clearly intended to blindside residents before they could process what they were being asked to fund. But Vivian hadn't accounted for the fact that the neighborhood was no longer asleep. Instead of panicking about emergency legal costs, homeowners began demanding answers. Why did we need hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight complaints that didn't look frivolous at all? The email chain that erupted afterward was a masterpiece. Martha Henderson fired the first shot with a simple question: has anyone actually seen proof that Mr. Steele's complaints are frivolous? Within hours, 23 residents replied with their own accounts of bogus fines, padded fees, and questionable contractor deals. By Sunday night, it was clear Vivian's emergency assessment wasn't just going to fail, it was going to implode in front of the entire community. Ironically, her attempt to force the vote had created the perfect venue for us to lay out our case. Cornered, Vivian turned to her dirtiest tactic yet. An anonymous report was filed with Child Protective Services, accusing me of being mentally unstable, obsessively stalking neighbors, and posing a danger to local children. It was malicious genius engineered to tie me up in months of investigations while shredding my reputation. But like every one of her schemes, it collapsed under scrutiny. And scrutiny had become our specialty. The CPS visit lasted all of 4 hours. Tuesday morning, a wary caseworker named Jonna Sullivan knocked on my door. Looking like someone who dealt with one too many spiteful neighbor complaints in her 20-year career. Mr. Steele, I'm here about a report regarding child safety concerns in your neighborhood. I invited her in, poured coffee, and laid out the entire story: the fraudulent fines, the corruption scheme, Vivian's escalation into vandalism, and now character assassination. I showed her the footage of Vivian smashing my generator, Harold Carter's meticulously documented financial records, and our growing catalog of manufactured violations. Jonna flipped through it all, then raised an eyebrow. Let me guess, the person who filed this complaint is also the one facing possible criminal charges for embezzlement. That would be correct, I said. She snapped her notebook shut with the finality of a gavel. Mr. Steele, in my experience, people who steal from their neighbors don't usually care about protecting children. Consider this case closed. But Jonna's visit sparked something unexpected: media attention. False CPS reports filed as retaliation for exposing HOA corruption turned out to be exactly the kind of human interest story local news couldn't resist. By Thursday morning, a Denver Channel 7 reporter was on the phone, asking if I'd appear in their weekend investigative segment on HOA abuse and corruption. That's when Vivian made her most disastrous decision yet. Instead of keeping her head down while the authorities closed in, she doubled down. She called her own press conference for Friday afternoon at the Pine Ridge Estates Community Center. Claiming she'd address malicious rumors and defend community integrity, Vivian honestly believed she could outtalk the evidence, bending public opinion with pure force of will. Rex Morrison and I showed up an hour early, only to find her arranging a makeshift podium, printed talking points in hand, and a slideshow ready to extol the virtues of strong governance and protecting property values. She'd even lined up folding chairs in neat rows, as if this were a polished corporate meeting, when in reality, she was about to answer for embezzlement and fraud. This is going to be good, Rex whispered as we watched Vivian rehearse in front of a mirror sheet propped against the wall, repeating her lines like an actress before opening night. The media presence far exceeded anyone's expectations. Channel 7 showed up with their full investigative crew, complete with cameras and a producer who had clearly studied HOA corruption cases before. The Denver Post sent their community affairs journalist armed with questions about financial accountability in residential associations. Even the small Jefferson County Journal sent a reporter, knowing a scandal like this would resonate with their suburban readers. But the biggest shock was the crowd. Instead of the small circle of loyal followers Vivian had counted on, nearly 80 homeowners filled the community center, many clutching copies of Harold Carter's financial records and their own violation letters. Vivian began confidently, sticking to her script. She spoke about her dedicated volunteer service, claimed she was protecting the neighborhood's investments, and painted herself as the target of harassment campaigns. She cast my property boundary dispute as the obsession of a grief-stricken man lashing out. The first crack appeared when Channel 7's reporter asked evenly, "Mrs. Hartwell, can you explain why $23.00 of HOA funds went to a management company that shares your home address?" Vivian's practiced smile wavered. "Those are complicated financial arrangements that aren't appropriate to discuss in this setting." Then Bob Schmidt's voice cut through from the audience. "What about the playground fund? Where did that money go? Financial details are board confidential." Vivian snapped, her veneer starting to melt under the lights like makeup in August. That's when Josephine Carter rose from the front row, Harold's folder clutched tight in her hands. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said firmly, "nothing about HOA finances should be hidden from the very homeowners who fund them." The dam broke. Residents erupted, shouting about bogus violation fines, inflated legal bills, and unexplained assessments. Vivian tried to keep control. But facing nearly 80 furious neighbors demanding answers is not something you can manage with corporate buzzwords. The knockout blow came from Jennifer Walsh. Calmly, she raised her hand and asked, "If Mr. Steele's complaints are nothing but harassment, why were you caught trying to vandalize his generator with a crowbar?" The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of stillness that falls when everyone realizes they are witnessing someone's end entire world collapse in real time. Vivian's expression flickered between shock, anger, and panic before landing on a mask of raw fury. "That's a complete lie," she screamed. "This meeting is a setup, orchestrated by people who want to destroy community governance." The Channel 7 cameras captured every second of her unraveling. She accused homeowners of conspiracy, called the questions elder abuse, demanded that the media leave, threatened lawsuits, and finally stormed toward the exit shouting about ungrateful neighbors who didn't appreciate her years of service. But she never reached the door. Sheriff's Deputy Martinez was waiting in the lobby with an arrest warrant for grand theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The cameras rolled as Vivian Hartwell was handcuffed and led away. Her carefully maintained composure shattered completely as she shrieked about framed jobs and malicious persecution. The revolution had reached its climax. Justice had arrived escorted by law enforcement and broadcast live on the evening news. But that was only the beginning. The arrest footage went viral within hours. By Saturday morning, HOA president arrested for embezzlement was trending statewide, with media outlets as far away as California and Florida picking up the story. Apparently, nothing struck a chord quite like a corrupt HOA leader finally being exposed. The real showdown came the following Tuesday at the emergency HOA meeting called to address what prosecutors were now describing as systematic financial fraud across multiple residential communities. Pine Ridge Estates had never seen anything like it. The parking lot overflowed with cars, news vans, and residents from nearby neighborhoods who had heard about our uprising. Inside, every chair was taken, with people pressed against the walls and peering through windows as though they were watching a championship fight. This time, the authorities were there too. Deputy Martinez sat alongside officials from the Colorado Secretary of State's office and agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division. What had begun as a neighborhood feud had blown wide open into what federal investigators now call a multi-jurisdictional conspiracy involving HOA corruption, contractor kickbacks, and money laundering. Benjamin Cross opened the meeting like a seasoned trial attorney, projecting Harold Carter's painstaking records onto large screens for the crowd. They showed checks to shell companies, forged signatures, and a 3-year trail of systematic theft totaling $180,000. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ben said, his voice steady over the silent room, "what you're looking at is more than embezzlement. This is organized fraud. Your homeowners association has been operated as a criminal enterprise." The collective gasped from the crowd sounded like a single sharp exhale, the moment of realization that they hadn't just been mismanaged, they'd been robbed blind. Martha Henderson broke down in tears when she saw the proof that her Rose Garden violation fine had paid for Vivian's Bahamas vacation. Bob Schmidt's face flushed crimson as the weight of years' worth of bogus violation fees his family had paid sank in. But the true shock came when Rex Morrison unveiled the results of his deeper investigation into a much larger web of corruption. Drawing from public records and financial trails, he revealed direct links between Vivian's scheme and similar frauds operating in for other Colorado neighborhoods. Pine Ridge Estates wasn't a one-off case, Rex explained, motioning toward a detailed chart that mapped money transfers between shell corporations and contractor kickbacks. This was part of a carefully structured system designed to siphon money from homeowners across Jefferson County. At that point, FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres stepped forward to address the packed room. At 45, she carried the composed authority of someone who had spent 2 decades dismantling the careers of Hawaii T-collar criminals. "Thanks to the evidence collected through your community's efforts," she announced, "a federal case has now been opened. We are pursuing charges of racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy that reach well beyond your neighborhood." Earlier today, search warrants were executed at 17 properties, and 6 individuals tied to this operation were taken into custody. Gasps rippled across the audience as the gravity of the situation hit home. Their whole battle had exposed a federal criminal enterprise involving millions siphoned from multiple communities. Yet the most powerful moment arrived when 78-year-old Josephine Carter, clutching her late husband's files, spoke into the microphone. She had become the unlikely moral compass of the movement, and her voice carried the steady conviction of someone who had witnessed far too much corruption Harold always told me that democracy only survives when ordinary people stand up to bullies, she began. For 3 years, fear kept us silent while our community was being robbed. But this week proved that when neighbors unite, justice isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The crowd rose to its feet in a 5-minute ovation. The formal votes that followed felt almost anticlimactic after Josephine's words. Vivian and her corrupt allies on the board were unanimously removed. Emergency elections were set for the following month. Every illegitimate fine and fee was officially overturned, with restitution promised to those affected. Most importantly, the community ratified the Pine Ridge Transparency Covenant new bylaws requiring monthly financial disclosures, open audits, and homeowner approval for any legal expenses above $500. My own vindication came moments later, when the interim board president, chosen by unanimous consent from the floor, delivered an announcement: the $30,000 fine against Garrett Steele is hereby nullified. And we extend the board's official apology for the harassment and unlawful enforcement actions by the previous administration. The applause was gratifying, but the deeper satisfaction came afterward. As I walked out of the center, inhaling the crisp mountain air tinged with the smell of oncoming snow, I realized that my cabin project had grown into something far bigger than a personal journey. It had become a symbol of ordinary people refusing to be cowed by corruption. Driving past the building, I saw neighbors lingering in small groups, sharing stories and mapping out plans for rebuilding community governance. Through my open truck window, the sound of laughter, hope, and genuine conversation drifted in like music. For the first time since Melody's passing, I felt like part of something larger than my grief. Healing had begun and it spread through our neighborhood like a fire of renewal. 6 months later, Vivian Hartwell stood in federal court to receive her sentence: 4 years in prison for racketeering, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The judge's words reflected what many of us felt. The defendant abused the fundamental trust placed in her by this community, turning a position of responsibility into a personal cash machine. The federal investigation ultimately reclaimed $2.3 million stolen across 5 HOA communities, with Pine Ridge Estates alone receiving $247,000 in restitution, far more than we had imagined. The probe revealed that Vivian's scheme had been even more elaborate than suspected, relying on fraudulent maintenance contracts, inflated insurance deals, and years of kickback arrangements. Yet the greatest victory wasn't financial, it was the transformation we could see with our own eyes. Our neighborhood had come alive again. The newly elected board, chosen in a landslide vote for openness and fairness, implemented reforms that soon became a model across Colorado: transparent budgets, competitive bidding for contracts, and homeowner approval for major spending replaced secrecy and intimidation. And at last, the playground that Vivian's theft had stalled was built, funded by the very restitution her downfall had made possible. The newly elected board, chosen in a landslide vote for openness and fairness, implemented reforms that soon became a model across Colorado: transparent budgets, competitive bidding for contracts, and homeowner approval for major spending replaced secrecy and intimidation. And at last, the playground that Vivian's theft had stalled was built, funded by the very restitution her downfall had made possible. My little cabin also took on a role I never anticipated. Neighbors began pointing it out to visitors as the place where the whole rebellion began. The irony wasn't lost on me. What started as a grief project had unexpectedly triggered a federal investigation and reshaped local governance. But the deepest transformation wasn't political or legal, it was personal. Constructing that cabin began as therapy for my loss, but fighting to keep it gave me direction again. Rex Morrison and I turned our efforts into a formal business, Boundary Solutions LLC, helping homeowners across Colorado handle property disputes and fight back against corrupt HOA letters. It turned out there was real demand for people who could read survey maps and weren't afraid to stand up to bullies. Josephine Carter soon became our unofficial partner, lending her lifetime of community organizing experience to help other neighborhoods rally against dishonest boards. At 79, she found a new calling, earning the nickname the whole whistleblower from local media as she traveled to communities where residents suspected financial misconduct. The ripple effect reached well beyond Jefferson County. The Colorado legislature passed the Pine Ridge Reform Act, mandating tighter financial oversight for HOA letters and establishing protections for whistleblowers who reported suspected wrongdoing. Similar bills were introduced in 6 other states, each citing our story as proof that whole governance was overdue for reform. Yet, the most rewarding change was seeing our own neighborhood rediscover real community spirit. HOA meetings that once felt like hostile interrogations became genuine conversations about priorities and improvements. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years began speaking up, offering ideas to benefit everyone instead of padding the pockets of a few. The annual Pine Ridge Community Festival, now funded with recovered embezzlement money, transformed into a celebration of what ordinary people can accomplish when they stand together. Reporters still drop by every year to cover the HOA that fought back, but to us, it's just life in a community that finally works the way it should. As I sit on my cabin porch today, sipping coffee while the sound of kids echoes from the Harold Carter Memorial Playground, I breathe in pine-scented mountain air and possibility. Coffee tastes different when you drink it in a place you built with your own hands and defended with your courage. Melody would have loved this. She always believed that good people, united, could overcome any hardship. She was right. Inside my cabin, the walls now display photos from our victory celebration, clippings from newspapers covering the federal case, and letters from homeowners in other states who used our fight as inspiration for their own. But my favorite memento is simple, a handwritten note from Josephine that reads, "Harold would be proud." So here's what I've learned from taking on a corrupt HOA and unintentionally launching a federal investigation. Bullies rely on exhaustion, fear, and isolation. They thrive when people stay silent. But if you stand your ground, document everything, and build coalitions with neighbors who share your values, even entrenched corruption can't withstand united community scrutiny. Now, I'd like to hear from you. Share your worst HOA nightmare in the comments. You're not alone in dealing with power-hungry boards that forget they're supposed to serve their residents, not dominate them. And if you enjoy watching bullies finally get what's coming to them through grassroots action, hit that subscribe button. Next week, I'll share the story of how I helped my elderly neighbor turn the tables on a contractor who tried to scam her out of her life savings. Because sometimes fighting back isn't just about getting personal justice, it's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. Thanks for tuning into HOA Stories. If this episode made you laugh, shake your head, or just feel grateful you're not in the middle of HOA chaos, hit that like button and drop your thoughts below. We post new HOA meltdowns, neighborhood drama, and tales of justice every week, so make sure to subscribe for the next unbelievable story.